Shadow Slave. Chapter 2221. The journey across the crumbling hellscape of the battlefield had been a perilous nightmare. Sunny and Nightmare cleaved into the mass of nightmare creatures, besieged from all sides by the frenzied avalanche of abominations. Crimson blood and scarlet sap spilled on the white bone, and mangled bodies toppled to the ground. They were swiftly swallowed by the red sea of spreading moss, only to rise again moments later. Even locked in a furious battle with the King of Swords, the Queen did not miss the chance to create new puppets. Sunny opened a gap in the tide of monsters, and the Sword Army followed the Dark Rider. However, the horrors of the liberated jungle were not the only danger facing the soldiers. There was the army of puppets and the devastating hurricane of flying swords, as well. He had to find a path through the cataclysmic battle of the two domains, avoiding the wider cracks that marred the surface of the fractured plane, the flashpoint in the obliterating confrontation between Key Song's puppets and Anvil's swords, and the caged titans. Even if he did, the danger still remained. At any moment, the two sovereigns could plummet from the sky, causing a violent detonation on the ground. If the army was caught in that violent explosion of annihilating forces, the casualties were going to be horrific. The saints would probably survive, and some of the masters too. But the awakened soldiers would become a cloud of crimson haze. What a mess. Sunny used his spear and manifested shadows to slaughter frenzied abominations. Nightmare used his fangs, his horns, and his hooves to furiously rip them apart. The aura of dread surrounding the black steed weakened the hungry nightmare creatures, which made the two of them even more deadly than they already were. Far behind, Sunny's other incarnations were struggling to preserve the fragile formation of the advancing army side by side with other saints of the sword domain. One of his avatars was protecting the rear, one was fighting on the right flank, and one was fighting on the left. Saint and Fiend were holding back the flood of nightmare creatures, as well. Nephis and her miraculous flames were at the head of the army, continuously healing the soldiers and following the path that he had carved. Somehow, unbelievably, they made it quite far. The casualties were heavy, and the formation of the Sword Army had turned into a complete mess, all pretenses of order obliterated by the carnage of the great battle and the complicated terrain of the fractured plain. But they still managed to tortuously extricate themselves from the worst of the Scarlet Flood and made it to the epicenter of the clash between the Dead Army and the Storm of Swords. That was perhaps even more dangerous than being surrounded by a sea of frenzied nightmare creatures. Neither the puppets nor the flying swords were hostile to the human soldiers, however, they did not seem concerned about collateral damage, either. There were cracks leading to the hollows here, as well, and the jungle UPD was attempting to escape to the surface from them, too, but most of the horrors that escaped the darkness were swiftly obliterated by the violent aftershocks of the harrowing battle between the two sovereigns. The army was only actively besieged from the rear now. Liberated from the dire need to fight the nightmare creatures, it closed ranks and concentrated on defense, the officers exerting their aspect powers to protect the awakened soldiers from the chaos, the mayhem, the destructive shockwaves of distant collisions, and the rustling streams of stray swords. Success was limited, at best. The ground was still quaking, the deafening cacophony of the battle was still unbearable, and the world still resembled a crumbling hell. In fact, now that the soldiers were not just witnessing the clash between the Supremes, but were in the midst of it, the chilling catastrophe of their clash had only become harder to conceive of, fathom, and endure. But they did endure. Even then, it was in no small part thanks to Sunny. He had not volunteered to become a guide for the reeling Sword Army merely because of how strong he was, and how fearsome his steed was. Rather, he was the best man for the job because his shadow sense was able to envelop the entire battlefield. Therefore, Sunny knew where to go, what path to choose, and which directions to steer clear of in order to avoid complete annihilation. The battered army slowly advanced through the carnage. All pretenses of maintaining an orderly formation had long been abandoned, and by now, it was nothing more than a vast mob. However, it was a mob of seasoned warriors, not panicking civilians. Faced with a horror too great to be fathomed, the soldiers had simply abandoned fear, somberly concentrating on the task at hand instead and refusing to think about anything else. Perhaps that was why they had survived. I need to hurry. Sunny was concerned about the Song army, as well. After all, Rain was there. Cassie was there, too, bound by the invisible strings of the Queen's power. As he was carving a blood path through the mayhem atop Nightmare and fighting to defend the splintering sword army, he was also tensely observing Rain. In the end, Sunny had no choice but to emerge from her shadow and reveal himself among the soldiers of Song for the first time since his sister had become one of them. Almost at the same time, he finally broke through the tide of abominations and came in view of the battered expanse of the Queen's soldiers. He regarded them for a moment from Nightmare's back, streams of blood running down the onyx surface of the mantle. The sight of him sitting atop Nightmare must have been quite terrifying. The Song army had done better than the warriors of the Sword Domain, but they too were on the verge of drowning in the Scarlet Flood. Neither of the sides were going to weather the calamity alone. Truthfully, even if they joined forces, their chances were not great. But wasn't it funny? These people had been ready to kill each other not too long ago, but now, their best chance to survive was to fight side by side with each other. I can't tell if that is poetic or ironic. Perhaps it was both. Somewhere behind, the vague silhouette of the Ivory Island revealed itself from the storm of swords, looming above the sword army as if trying to shield it from the fury of the supreme battle above. Raising his spear, Sunny leaned forward and tossed it at the soldiers of Song. They did not even have time to react. Tearing the air, the dark spear instantly breached the remaining distance and nailed a monstrous spider that had been lunging at Seishin to the ground. Spinning swiftly, she spent a split second to stare at the spider, then turned her head and looked at Sunny. He met her gaze coldly, remained motionless for a moment, and then gave her an exaggerated bow. Behind him, the banners of the Sword Army fluttered in the hurricane wind. Chapter 2222. Sunny would have loved to say that the two great armies united in a beautiful display of human camaraderie, but in reality, nothing that grand happened. The bone plain was still crumbling, and the jungle was still spilling from the depths of the hollows like a scarlet tide. The situation worsened quickly, and all that remained of order, what little of it had been left by then, swiftly collapsed into mayhem and chaos. Minutes after the Sword Army reached the buckling line of Song's soldiers, both forces were overwhelmed by the flood of abominations. The ground quaked, and the cracks spread. The battle lines collapsed, the officers lost control of their units, and the two forces merged into one vast sea of desperately fighting soldiers. It was not that the Song soldiers and the warriors of the Sword Domain, who had been enemies less than an hour ago, discarded their differences and embraced each other as comrades. It was just that no one cared about which side the people around them belonged to anymore. There were only humans and nightmare creatures on the bone plain, now. And the demigods who continued their terrifying battle in the sky and on the ground, ravaging the fractured surface of Godgrave with their inhuman power. If there was one reason why the soldiers still held, refusing to collapse into the endless tide of dreadful abominations, it was that the core of the human sea stood like a monolith in the path of the nightmare creatures and broke their terrifying momentum. There, white radiance shone beautifully amidst the maelstrom of steel and abominable flesh, washing over the human warriors and healing their wounds, while at the same time enveloping the grotesque figures of the powerful nightmare creatures and melting them like wax. That was where Changing Star made her stand. The seasoned veterans of the two great armies rallied behind her, serving as an anchor for the mass of desperate soldiers and preventing them from drowning helplessly in the encroaching darkness. Sunny played his part as well, of course. While Nephes made herself the axis of the sea of human warriors, he spread his avatars and shadows along the edges of their disorganized mass. There were 5 incarnations of the Lord of Shadows sowing death and destruction on the fractured bone plain, now, as well as Saint, Fiend, and Nightmare. There were also all the saints of the two domains, fighting side by side. In one corner of the battlefield, Sunny couldn't help but chuckle when he found himself fighting side by side with Saint Jest. He was still determined to kill the old bastard, but that would have to wait until a later date. In another place, he found himself rescuing none other than Beastmaster from the jaws of a great monster. The beautiful enchantress spared him a glance and smiled weakly. "Well, aren't you a sight for sore eyes, Lord Shadow?" He looked at her coldly, then sneered behind the visor of his helmet. "Sorry to say this, but you seem to only have one eye left." Commanding her thralls to lunge at the avalanche of nightmare creatures, Beastmaster grinned. Her grin looked quite terrifying, considering that the entire left side of her face was missing. "Don't you worry, it will heal." "Ah, why did they also go for my face?" Someplace else, Sunny saw Summer Night making his way toward the distant radiance of Nef's flames. He saw Dar of the Maharana clan unleashing a devastating rain of arrows on the nightmare creatures besieging Rivalan of Aegis Rose. He also saw Saint Ali taking on a great beast that threatened to devour Mercy of Clan Dagonet, Jest's grandson. That one was both poetic and ironic as well. But mostly, Sunny had no time to observe the raging sea of violence boiling all around him, since he was forced to concentrate on his own 5 avatars and the distant clash between the two sovereigns. Somewhere on the battlefield, Sid the Fire Keeper cursed as she dodged the claws of an enormous abomination. The beast resembled a monstrous ape with 6 spindly arms, its gaunt body full of festering wounds and crawling with wriggling maggots. She used her aspect to deliver a powerful blow to the creature, but her sword barely managed to leave a scratch on its skin. Her shield, however, slammed into it with enough force to throw the abominable ape back. A slender figure in a red dress was revealed on the ground behind it, struggling to rise. Sid grabbed the woman and pulled her to her feet. "Stand up, you fool." Felice looked up at her with a dazed expression, blood flowing down her beautiful face. She spoke hoarsely. "I can't stand on my own." Sid snarled. "Shut the hell up and help me." The two faced the nightmare creatures, covering each other's backs. Sid brandished her sword, while Felice raised her wavy dagger. A moment later, the abominations were upon them. Some distance away, Saint Tyrus of White Feather was facing down a great demon, her cold face betraying no emotion. Unable to assume her transcendent form in the storm of deadly swords, she was forced to fight as a human. As she lunged forward, a powerful gale pushing her sword to incredible speed, an enormous winged lion with white fur crashed into the demon, tearing into its side with sharp fangs. The great nightmare creature simply shook it off, turning to unleash a fatal attack at his wife. Before its jaws closed around Tyrus, however, a wave of darkness surrounded it like a whirlpool, and Revel appeared from it like a beautiful fiend. The onyx talons crowning her wings pierced the demon's throat, and she grabbed its jaws with both hands, straining her muscles to rip them apart. A pained roar drowned the thunderous clamor of the battle, and black blood flowed down. Not too far from the three of them, Rain and Tamar found themselves surrounded by a swarm of human-sized insects. The ant-like creatures were less indestructible than other horrors of the ancient jungle, but their sheer number was a terror to behold. They were fighting them desperately, with Rain wounding the abominations and Tamar finishing them off. However, the monstrous ants were simply too many. Just as Rain staggered, a bolt of lightning suddenly flashed past her, striking into the mass of vile creatures and chaining from one to another, instantly causing several of them to collapse. Glancing back, she saw a young woman with golden hair, her armor dented and her white cloak smeared in blood. The young woman spun, cutting down another abomination, and took a shaky step back. The three of them found themselves standing back to back with each other. Taking a labored breath, Rain forced out a smile. "Hey, you, I know you, don't I?" The Feather Knight answered without turning, her tone cold. "I guess." Rain chuckled. "How's your leg?" As the swarms of ants recovered from the damage dealt by the lightning and rushed at them, the young woman answered with a hint of vitriol in her voice. "How's your neck?" Sadly, there was no time to answer. Far away, standing on the battered surface of the Ivory Island, Sunny tilted his head to avoid a stray piece of shrapnel and looked into the sky with a grim expression. There, a river of blood and a rustling sphere of deadly steel collided once again, tearing a hole in the storm of swords. Down below, the titans were slowly breaking out of their chains. His eyes were dark. He exhaled slowly. Not yet. 2223. High above the battlefield, the King of Swords was still being pursued by the river of crimson blood. Surrounded by the storm of swords, he retreated closer and closer to the swirling veil of radiant clouds, as if being driven into a corner. Far below, the fractured bone plain was swelling with scarlet rot, and the dead titans were struggling against the chains of sorcery that bound them. The shimmering runes formed by countless flying swords were already vague and distorted, on the verge of crumbling. Finally, one of the colossal creatures broke free of its ethereal cage and steeped forward, ready to unleash its profane power. Before it could, however, Anvil spun in the air and slashed with one of his dreadful swords, causing the world itself to split in half. The thin line where reality seemed to be cut extended all the way down to the surface of the shattered battlefield, passing across the gargantuan figure of the Titan. A moment later, the world healed itself, and the scar left on its fabric by the king's strike was erased. The Titan, however, staggered and fell apart, cut cleanly in two. The severed giant plummeted down. Its mountain-like body was so vast that a dozen seconds passed before its dreadful mass hit the ground. When it did, the entire bone plane shuddered, and the cracks marring its fractured surface grew wider. By then, Anvil was already landing on the quaking bone. Grasping his two swords and commanding the other 5 to form a rustling sphere of lethal steel around him once again, he looked at the great waterfall of blood that threatened to drown him, and attacked. This time, his attacks were eerily different in nature. They seemed the same, but there was something uncanny about the way his swords moved now, as if he was aiming their dreadful blades at something that mortals could not even perceive, let alone fathom. The river of blood rippled strangely and reeled back, as if hurt. All around the battlefield, hundreds of dead puppets fell to the ground lifelessly. There were no wounds on their bodies, and no blood flowing to the surface of the ancient bone. However, despite that, the corpses remained laying on it motionlessly, as if the queen had no power over them anymore. Lowering his sword slightly, Anvil stared at the crimson wall of blood towering above him darkly. A cold voice resounded from beneath the visor of his black helmet. "Why don't you get serious, now?" A melodious laughter suddenly surrounded him, carried by the gales of hurricane wind. "Shall I?" As the echoes of the queen's laughter were swallowed by the cacophony of battle, the sea of crimson blood rippled once again and receded a little. Some distance away, the colossal corpse of the slain titan that towered above the plain like a mountain stirred suddenly, and then moved. The flesh of the gargantuan creature began to rot with tremendous speed, soon turning into a flood of viscous crimson liquid. The revolting mass of it flowed forward and rose from the ground, surrounding the sea of blood like a shell. Then, the process of decomposition was reversed, and it turned solid again. Soon, a terrifying flesh golem rose above the fractured plain, towering above it at hundreds meters in height. The river of blood was now contained within it, flowing through its veins and nurturing it with supreme power. Pieces of broken bone extended through the monstrous doll's torn skin, and a vague outline of a human face lay hidden beneath the hideous features of its face. Anvil let out a low chuckle. Ah, how distasteful! As torrents of flying swords twisted in the air and plummeted down, aiming to tear the towering flesh golem apart, it lunged forward with speed that no creature of that size was supposed to possess. Its two gargantuan hands rose, and then fell down like crushing hammers. Anvil's 5 swords rushed forward to block the harrowing strike, and the moment the fists of the queen met them, a flash of light drowned the battlefield for a moment, and an obliterating shockwave spread in all directions, disintegrating thousands of flying swords, turning countless puppets into bloody haze, and causing several enormous pieces of the bone plane to plummet into the depths of the hollows. Observing the cataclysmic collision from the distant surface of the ivory island, Sunny shivered. He did not have to turn away to look at the pitiful state of the two great armies. Nephis was still holding the core of the vast, disorganized mob of human soldiers together, while he was dealing with the worst of the nightmare tied at its edges. The saints were still fighting, and the awakened warriors were still enduring, as well. But the situation was turning grimmer and grimmer with each minute. He was barely preserving all his incarnations and keeping the truly powerful abominations away from reign. The amount of essence he received back from slaughtering nightmare creatures had fallen behind the amount he was expending some time ago, and Nephis was not doing any better. His shadows were receiving one wound after another, and if even Fiend was suffering damage, then the saints of the two domains would soon be on the verge of death. In fact, a few of them had already perished. Beastmaster's thralls were nearly eradicated. The forged echoes of the Valor elites had all been destroyed. The casualties among the soldiers were mounting, and with every one of them that fell, there was one less warrior to stem the flood of abominations left standing. Worse still, the jungle was escaping onto the surface of the fractured plain. Before, the humans only had to contend the dreadful predators of the hollows, but now, the spreading scarlet plague was threatening to swallow them, as well. The hungry moss, the bloodthirsty grass, the poisonous thorns of slithering vines, the clouds of deadly pollen, the spores that landed on human flesh only to sprout abominable mycelia through it, the soldiers had to suffer all of it and more, all the while being torn apart and devoured by the ghastly nightmare creatures. He had joked about Beastmaster's missing eye before, but really, Sunny was disturbed by the sight. If even the immensely powerful Princess of Song could not protect herself in this inconceivable calamity, then what hope did the rest of them have? Sunny's thoughts turned somber. The plan was to wait until the sovereigns had exhausted each other, or, better yet, had brought each other to the brink of death. He and Neffys were only supposed to attack them then. However, Sunny was not sure that they could wait for much longer, not anymore. Not only were the great armies in a desperate situation, but Sunny and Neffys were wasting essence. Both of them possessed vast reserves of it, but those reserved would only continue to dwindle. Then, who would be exhausted and on the brink of death by the time they entered the fray? Looking into the distance with a grim expression, Sunny grimaced. So, then, when were they supposed to attack? Only one person knew the answer. I need to find Cassie. 2224. Out there on the battlefield, Cassie felt less and less like a living marionette. Ki-song still held power over her body and soul, of course, but was either too distracted to control Cassie's every move or had simply decided to allow her some measure of freedom. At the moment, Cassie was unsure whether to feel relieved or regretful about her sudden liberation. Her body had been controlled by the Queen entirely when the flood of nightmare creatures first descended upon the Song army. It was a strange experience, to feel herself move with martial skill far greater than her own, slaying powerful abominations with the cold composure of a born killer. It was even stranger still because Cassie could only see herself with Seishin's eyes. Her face was the same, and her body was the same. However, everything else was unfamiliar, her fierce poise, her deadly grace, the smooth fluidity of her confident movements. Cassie could both feel and see her body fight, but she had no part in making it move. It was eerie. The role the Queen wanted her to play, it seemed, was to protect Seishin, even at the cost of her own life. So, Cassie's body was like a bodyguard for the beautiful Princess of Song, whether she liked it or not. As the battle between Ki-song and Anvil entered a new stage, however, she could suddenly move on her own again. She also had far greater access to her aspect again, which made up somewhat for losing the macabre guidance of the Queen. Cassie was still not entirely free, though. There were certain things that her own body was preventing her from doing, like straying too far from Seishin, for example, or aiming her rapier at Seishin's back. I wouldn't want to kill her, anyway. Cassie needed Seishin alive as much as the Queen wanted her to survive. The two of them had stood in front of the 7th Legion when the battle started. As the abominable jungle broke free from the dim darkness of the hollows and the dreadful abominations escaped to the surface, Seishin attempted to get the Song army to react in time. She was one of the first to realize the consequences of the bone plane fracturing, and acted accordingly. Seishin's swift actions saved numerous lives, but not enough lives. The battle swiftly descended into utter chaos. The Song army was just as fractured as the battlefield was, the soldiers separated from each other by the jagged cracks and the scarlet tide rising from them. It was all but impossible to regain any significant measure of control over the formation, but Seishin and Beastmaster still tried, desperately attempting to get the army to pull back. The precarious battle line was on the verge of collapsing when the Lord of Shadow broke through the endless horde of abominations on his monstrous steed, covered in blood and leading the ravaged sword army behind him. The situation turned a bit better after that, for a short while, but also even more chaotic. All distinctions between units were discarded, and the humans simply fought side by side, not caring who was friend and who was foe. A terrible carnage usurped the world. The battle took Seishin and Cassie away from the core of the vast mob of human soldiers, where Neffys and the Fire Keepers held the core against the deadliest of the nightmare creatures. By then, Cassie had regained enough of her powers to use her awakened and ascended abilities freely. Her own performance was far below what she had been able to accomplish under the Queen's control, but adequate enough to stay alive, just barely. Seishin, on the contrary, was only growing stronger the more blood was spilled around them. It was unclear who was protecting whom, now, and yet, even the daughter of the Queen was not doing too well in the feverish mayhem of the calamitous battle. Both of them were covered in blood and wounded, their armor tattered and breached. All Cassie could do was stay close to Seishin and follow her as the older woman moved through the battlefield with a strange sense of purpose, her beautiful face turning darker and more desperate with each second. Veil. Suddenly, Seishin lunged forward, discarding all pretense of caution. She tore into the mass of nightmare creatures, her claws tearing their hides like sharp blades. Her fangs ripped into them, as well, sending rivers of fetid blood spilling to the ground. Each wound Seishin dealt to the abominations bled far more profusely than it should have, and the dreadful beings died far more swiftly, and far more gruesomely, than Cassie had expected. Breaking through the mass of nightmare creatures, they came about a desolate section of the battlefield. Here, no human soldier had survived, and heaps of abominable bodies lay on the ground, piled high. There were some thralls of Beastmaster scattered between the dead abominations, all torn to shreds and dead. At the center of the vast graveyard of nightmare creatures, a sole figure was sprawled on the ground, surrounded by a ring of emptiness. It was a delicate woman with a slender build, both her enchanting face and her white hair painted red by blood, Moonveil, Saishan's sister. Dismissing her monstrous form, Saishan dashed toward the motionless figure and fell to her knees near it, leaning close to press her ear against Moonveil's bloodied chest. Cassie could hear her mumbling quietly. Alive, still alive. The battle was raging around them, and some hideous horrors could attack them at any moment. Standing above Saishan, Cassie turned and raised her weapons, ready to attack. Her pale lips twisted into a faint smile under the dirt and grime of the battlefield. Maintaining a neutral tone, Cassie spoke without turning back. It is hard to envy the burden of your mother's love. She had waited to speak these words for a long time. Turning away from unconscious Moonveil for a moment, Saishan looked up with ire in her cold, piercing eyes. Then, her gaze slid further, rising to behold the storm of swords raging in the distant sky. A few words could cut deeper than a sword, if spoken at the right moment. And a tiny seed of doubt could grow into a towering tree, if planted into fertile soil. Saishan was too smart to have no doubt, but she needed a push to accept it. In these days that they spent together, Cassie had been subtly preparing to give her that push. The daughters of Ki Song were too loyal to their mother. The only thing they were more loyal to were each other. These orphan girls who had been taken from the streets to be raised as indomitable warriors cherished each other more than they loved the queen. That was the lever Cassie had to use if she wanted to send them plummeting into the pit of betrayal. To make them choose, and therefore save their lives when Nephis took her throne. Saishan's eyes hardened subtly as she watched her mother clash against the King of Swords in the distance as her sister bled in her arms. Looking away, she started to summon a memory and gritted her teeth. Shut up. Cassie smiled and obeyed her command. After all, she had already said what she wanted to say. And Saishan had already made a choice, even if she did not realize it yet. I hope Moonveil survives. But if she didn't, the lesson would only sink deeper. Cassie sighed. At that moment, she was distracted by a dark figure that appeared some distance away, and a voice that resounded in her head. Cassie, I need to know about the others. Have your powers returned? She took a deep breath. Her powers had returned, indeed. Chapter 2225, Broken Covenant. The shattered moon shone upon the ruined castle. The cold winds howled as they passed through the ruins, slamming into piles of rubble with vengeful power. An especially strong gust sent a small pebble falling from a broken wall into a pan of bubbling stew. Morgan ignored the pebble. She ignored Nightingale, who landed nearby, as well. Instead, she looked up and let out a long sigh. Loyalty. Loyalty was a funny thing. It came in many forms and many shapes, from different sources. Loyalty had a power in and of itself, a great power, sometimes, but in the realm of supremes, it also possessed a mystical authority. It was the covenant between a ruler and the people. It was the lifeblood of a domain, as well as the means through which domains spread. To be precise, for those supremes who built their domains with the help of the nightmare spell, it was the loyalty of saints that mattered most. Because their kingdoms were built from citadels, and most people, even those of the supreme rank, could only control one citadel at a time. There were exceptions, of course, like her monstrous brother, but those exceptions only served to prove the rule. So, saints became proxies for the supremes, controlling citadels in their name. To do so, they had to pledge their fealty to a sovereign, and swear loyalty to a domain. But loyalty was not an event. It was a process. Therefore, even if a saint swore an oath of fealty, their loyalty was not carved in stone. It could grow more powerful or weaken, it could even become entirely exhausted, dissolving like a mirage. If that happened, the sovereign would lose a vassal, and the domain would lose a citadel. But it was not easy to exhaust someone's loyalty. Because loyalty came in many forms. There was personal loyalty to a sovereign, like what Sir Gilead and other retainers of the great clan Valor felt. There was also a more abstract kind of loyalty like that of vassal saints, who were not necessarily devoted to their sovereign, but were instead devoted to the domain itself, because their families, clans, friends, and comrades were a part of it. And many more. That was why a vassal saint could despise a sovereign, but still be part of the sovereign's domain. Domains were vast things, after all, and encompassed much more than solely their rulers. Which was why it was so ironic that Morgan, the daughter of a sovereign, had no loyalty left. It was because to her, the sword domain was precisely that, it was solely a representation of her father. She was raised to be a ruler, and for that reason, her connection to the vast complexity of the domain was different from that of everyone else. It was far more simple, and therefore, far more easily destroyed. Morgan did not have friends or comrades, she only had subordinates, who were mere tools. Her clan and her family were a single person, the King of Swords. AOVS. And so, once she lost all faith in her father, she lost the connection to the sword domain as well. Perhaps she was simply selfish, not caring about anyone or anything else. It can't be, I am Morgan of Valor, I am the princess of the sword domain. But it could. Morgan smiled crookedly. Her brother had her beat. The bastard. A forlorn chuckle escaped her lips. Lady Morgan, are you all right? She turned her head, noticing Nightingale looking at her with concern. The others seemed wary, too. Right, there were her 6 transcendent blades, as well. What the hell was she supposed to do? Morgan forced out a smile. I am perfectly fine. But she wasn't. She was supposed to defend Bastion from Mordred. To prevent it from falling into his hands, and therefore becoming lost to her father, empowering the Key Song instead. Today was the day of the full moon, one that had repeated countless times, which meant that even those who did not control the Great Citadel would be able to travel between its true and illusory versions in a few hours. All her brother had to do to conquer Bastion was cross over to the other side, enter the illusory version of the ancient castle, and tether his soul to its gateway, thus overriding her own imprint. But it was all meaningless, now. Bastion was already lost to the King of Swords. Her brother would without a doubt still want to conquer it for the Queen of Worms, and for himself, as well. However, did Morgan still want to defend it? Perhaps she did. Not for the sword domain, but for herself. But even if she did, was there a reason to make these people die for it? Morgan studied her saints. Soul Reaper, raised by wolves, Nightingale, Knave, Bloodwave, Ether. She had conscripted them into this war, and watched them die countless times. To be honest, Morgan was a little sick of it. How strange. She was not a part of the sword domain anymore, but she had never been anything else. Morgan's entire sense of self was tied to the great clan Valor, and therefore, all her actions had always been for the benefit of the clan. Now that she had turned her back on that, there was no structure to the world, and nothing for her to lean on. It had been reasonable and a matter of course to sacrifice these people for the sword domain, if need be, before. But what about now? There was no reason to force them to their deaths whatsoever. Apart from Morgan's own selfish desire to defeat her brother, of course. Was she despicable enough to condemn her subordinates to death for a purely selfish reason? Yes, I am. But she was not pathetic enough to do so. Morgan had nothing else left, but she still had her pride. She did not have to deceive anyone into fighting her brother for her. If she were to defeat him, she was going to defeat him herself. Chapter 2226, Pebble Stew. The 6 saints stared at her in confusion. The expressions of the Knight saints were, quite predictably, subtly different from those of the government saints, who seemed to have learned about the loop recently. Morgan observed their reactions with morbid curiosity. Eventually, it was Knave who broke the silence. The battle is over. What do you mean? Morgan fished the damn pebble out of the stew and shrugged. You probably don't remember, but I borrowed a very special supreme memory from Soul Reaper a while back. That memory, in combination with my aspect, allowed me to force the same day to repeat itself over and over again. This day, to be precise. The 7 of us have battled my brother countless times today, and we have lost countless times. Each of you died a variety of gruesome deaths. If I recall correctly, you were beheaded the last time, Saint Knave. Good thing I came to my senses in time. The stew was about to be burnt. She removed the pan from the fire and looked at the 6 saints. But it's meaningless now. I won't borrow the supreme memory again, and I won't turn the time back again. Today will be the last time I battle my brother in these ruins. So, if you die this time, you'll remain dead forever. Therefore, I am giving you a chance to leave. No strings attached. They stared at her in stunned silence. For a while. Then, Knave gritted his teeth. We came here, to avenge the slain members of our clan, to stand against this monster. His voice was full of powerless fury and indignation. Morgan looked at him coldly. You failed. She sighed, then went about scooping the stew into their bowls. Vengeance is a noble goal, Saint Knave, and I would never advocate something as tasteless as forgiveness. However, there is some wisdom to what people say. Before you embark on a journey of revenge, you should dig 2 graves, one for your enemy, and one for yourself. Fools tend to believe that this saying admonishes revenge as a path to self-destruction, but I disagree. I rather see it as a warning that those seeking revenge must be prepared to die if they want to succeed. Morgan handed Knave a bowl of steaming stew and looked him in the eye. So, are you prepared to die? I think you do, I know you do, since I saw you die 100 times. However, don't you have a family out there in the waking world? What will happen to your daughter if you die? What will happen to the survivors of the House of Night if all 3 of you die? Shouldn't you concentrate on protecting the precious things you have left instead of avenging the things you lost? She did not really care about whether Knave lived or died that much. But, his daughter was cute. So, Morgan did not want to see the little girl lose her father on her account. The Saint of Night looked at her with dark intensity. Quote, You did not seem to care about that when you made us your cannon fodder, Lady Morgan. She smiled. That was because I believed I had a better cannon back then. But things have changed. Morgan sighed. Go, return to the waking world and forget about my brother. The remains of your clan are with the government now, they'll need saints to guide them across the oceans. The House of Night may cease to exist, but you might rebuild it as well. The decision is yours. She turned her gaze to the government saints. And it was a pleasure to fight side by side with the 3 of you. Really, it was quite spectacular, not that I had expected anything less from my sister's companions. But everything good must come to an end. The government will be in a precarious situation once the war ends, since it won't be needed anymore, since Earth won't be needed anymore. The winner won't care about the waking world. So, the waking world will need you. They glanced at each other, something strange revealing itself in their eyes for a moment. Morgan ignored their strange gazes and summoned a beautifully crafted, flawlessly cleaned spoon into her hand. Picking up her own bowl, she said, Eat. The food is getting cold. The 6 saints looked at her somberly, then at each other. Eventually, though, they picked up their bowls as well. No one else had a set of memory utensils, of course, and the ones they used were quite appalling. The meal passed in dead silence. Morgan suspected that this would be the last time. They shared food, which made her feel a little wistful. But only a little. After the meal was finished, she went away to give them some time to discuss things among themselves. Not too much time, though, since her brother would undoubtedly attack soon. By the time she returned, the decision seemed to have been made. Knave, Bloodwave, and Ether looked at her silently for a while. Eventually, the youngest, Ether, gave her a small bow. Lady Morgan, we will be departing. She smiled at him faintly. Better not waste any time, then. He hesitated for a few moments before nodding stiffly. I hope we will meet again, one day. The bastard. You should not have rejected me if you were going to act sentimental. With that, the 3 saints of the House of Night left. They returned to the waking world, disappearing from the moonlit ruins without a trace. The emptiness they left behind felt larger than Morgan had anticipated. She lingered for a bit, then shifted her gaze to the 3 government saints. It was a bit surprising that they were still here. Morgan raised an eyebrow. Not leaving. They remained silent for a while. Soul Reaper Jet was leaning on the crumbling wall, looking at the fire lazily. Raised by Wolves was sitting on a piece of rubble, tossing his famous memory, the Black Beast locket, into the air and catching it again absent-mindedly, a strangely somber expression on her usually lively face. Nightingale was studying Morgan, as if searching for something. Eventually, it was Raised by Wolves who broke the silence. The family home is in Bastion, you know. Morgan gave her a curious glance. But your family is safe and sound in NQSC. Does it really matter? She smiled darkly and did not respond. Instead, Nightingale asked, his voice as pleasant as always. Lady Morgan, the war is about to end, is it not? One way or another. She looked at his obnoxiously handsome face and shrugged. The final battle should be happening any day now, it might even be raging as we speak. He hesitated for a few moments, then asked, "Why are you giving up, then?" Morgan smiled bitterly. What did he know? That fool. I have not given up. It's just that I already lost. In the next moment, though, her smile turned cold and sharp. That is no reason to surrender, however. No matter what happens, I intend to defend Bastion until I die. Or until my brother dies, that would be much better. Nightingale looked at her with a hint of sadness in his eyes. His voice was like honey. I'd prefer if you didn't. Morgan gave him a strange look. She lingered for a few moments, then shook her head in bewilderment. What do I care about your preferences? Nightingale remained silent for a while, then looked up and let out a heavy sigh. No, you don't understand. I'm afraid I must insist. Morgan frowned. What does he? Before she could finish the thought, however, Nightingale looked at her and said, a strange firmness finding its way into his beautiful voice, I am truly sorry, Lady Morgan. But, please don't move. And as he spoke, an eerie power suddenly constrained Morgan, crushing her like a vice and paralyzing her body. Obeying his command, she froze. Chapter 2227. Nightingale told her to cease movement, and so, Morgan found herself unable to move. It was as if her body had turned into an ice sculpture. She could still breathe, but nothing more than that. His clear voice had easily crushed her defenses, seeped past the barriers erected by her potent memories, and caught her completely by surprise. Such power! Morgan attempted to disobey the overwhelming finality of his command, desperately struggling against her own body. But it was of no use. She was completely and utterly at his mercy. Ha, ha ha. Vulnerable as she was, Morgan mostly felt amused. There was more than a fair bit of indignant disbelief in her heart, as well, but no fear, not only because she was not a person who felt fear easily, but also because she found herself not caring that much about what would happen to her. Still, sure, she had failed to remain vigilant at all times, turning a blind eye to the potential threat presented by her supposed comrades. Perhaps it was because she had stayed with them for so long, and had experienced so much, but Morgan allowed herself to lower her guard around them, forgetting that for these three, most of the time they had shared amounted to merely a single day. She had also been conserving essence in preparation for the final battle against her brother, and so, the more powerful of her defensive memories were not even active. And, she was exhausted. However, the fact still remained. It was too easy to forget sometimes because of how nice he seemed, but Nightingale, he was a terrifying man, that slayer of dragons. Or rather, he had the potential to be terrifying, simply choosing not to abuse his dreadful power. But what is he trying to do? Morgan doubted that Nightingale would have struck a deal with her brother. So was it some misguided scheme to save her life against her will? To whisk her away to safety, whether she wanted to or not? Knowing the man, no, even for him, it would have been too ridiculous and infantile. She was not sure, and infuriatingly enough, she could not even ask. All she could do was stare at the charming bastard with cold fury burning in her eyes. Nightingale met her sharp gaze without looking away, a hint of regret apparent in his firm gaze. A few moments later, he sighed and turned to his companions. I won't be able to hold her for long. But it should be long enough. Raised by wolves scoffed and caught her black locket one last time, rising from the piece of rubble. Soul Reaper pushed herself off the wall and came closer, studying Morgan lazily. Morgan felt a chill run down his spine under that relaxed gaze. Jet clicked her tongue and glanced at Nightingale. That's great, but what are we supposed to do with her? Simply killing her is not an option. I presume. Even though, gods. No, she deserved to die for all the vile crap she and her clan are guilty of. Morgan stared at her with dark amusement, undisturbed by the threat of being killed and the stark accusation both. Not a rescue, then. They wouldn't be considering disposing of her if it was. So what the hell were they planning? Nightingale shook his head. We are not killing her. Soul Reaper sighed with regret. What, then? He hesitated for a few moments, then shrugged. I'll just take her with me. It will, probably be alright. Jet looked at him with a dubious frown. At that moment, Raised by Wolves spoke in a subdued tone. Whatever. If Kai says that it will be alright, then it will be alright. We don't have any time to waste. Anyway, Cassie is not responding after giving us the signal, which means that things are not going great out there. None of us expected that the day would come so soon, and in such a strange manner. But now that it did, there is no way back. Each of us knows what we must do, so, take Morgan and leave. Before her brother shows up. Nightingale and Soul Reaper looked at her with concern. Eventually, Jet spoke softly. Are you sure that you can do it? Raised by Wolves looked at her for a few moments, then grinned. Worry about yourself, big sister. I'll be fine. Morgan observed them intently, trying to understand what the three were trying to achieve. Were they retreating, but leaving Raised by Wolves behind? Why? The woman, meanwhile, looked at Nightingale and remained silent for a bit. Then, she grasped his shoulder for a moment and pushed him away. Go. I'll be fine, let's all meet in NQSC when it's all said and done. Actually, let's meet in Bastion, I know an amazing cafe there. Not as well as Neffy's knows it, though. Wait, did she take the cafe with her? Nightingale took a few steps back from her push, remained silent for a second, and then smiled. Are you really thinking about food even now? No. Of course you are. With that, he rose into the air and moved further away. Soon, a magnificent dragon with scales the color of the midnight sky towered above the ruins, his eyes shining like two cold white stars. Morgan still couldn't move. In fact, the moment Nightingale assumed his transcendent form, she felt that the power binding her grew even more inescapable. Damn it! She had just barely managed to move one of her fingers slightly when Soul Reaper grabbed her unceremoniously and leapt on the dragon's back. Two enormous wings raised a hurricane, and the great beast shot into the dark sky. Leaving the ruins behind, Morgan saw a glimpse of Raised by Wolves, who was left standing alone on the rubble. Athena followed the dragon's flight with her gaze for a few moments, then turned away and faced the distant forest, where Mordred was preparing to besiege Bastion one last time. The ruins swiftly grew smaller, and the empty lake did, as well, soon disappearing from view. Morgan had finally left the ruined castle after fighting to defend it for so long. The battle for Bastion was over. At least it was for her. Chapter 2228. Left alone in the ruins of True Bastion, Effie sighed and summoned her spear, leaning on it as she waited for Mordred to come. Despite having just eaten Morgan's stew, which was surprisingly delicious, almost as if the cold princess had cooked it specifically to suit Effie's taste, she suddenly felt hungry again. Hunger was an old friend. Ah, what a strange day. Today was a strange day for everyone, but it was especially so for Effie, because she was experiencing it differently from Jet and Kai. That was because not too long ago, or rather, many days ago, a familiar voice had resounded in her mind, urging Effie to secretly return to the waking world. That had happened soon after Jest of Clan Dagonet attempted to kill Cassie, while she was on her way to be captured by the Queen of Worms. Back then, the Seven Saints had all been ready to face Mordred and his transcendent vessels once again. Effie placed her tether in the ruins of True Bastion, then used the commotion to leave the dream realm unseen. She rushed to the rendezvous point Cassie had mentioned, expecting to meet the blind seer herself. However, instead, the person waiting for her in an abandoned underground factory in the outskirts was none other than the Lord of Shadows. Effie returned to True Bastion after their meeting was concluded. Next thing she knew, she traveled back in time by a few hours, meaning that she had entered the loop, died, and returned to its start like everyone else, gods knew how many times. It was just that she retained her memories from before entering the loop for the second time now, which included the few hours of her first experience there, the meeting with the Lord of Shadows, and the things they had discussed. Stranger still, the signal she was supposed to receive days, or maybe even weeks after the meeting was already resounding in her head. Cassie's voice was weak and distant, as if she was struggling to pierce through some kind of interference to warn Effie, and she swiftly fell silent after delivering the message. It was so confusing that Effie's head hurt, but having been taught a bitter lesson by the tomb of Ariel, she tried not to think about it too much. There was no time to think about anything too deeply, anyway. Effie had shared what she learned with Jet and Kai, and an hour later, here she was. All alone in the creepy ruins. Looking down, she studied the black beast locket with a tense expression. Can I really pull this off? Somewhere in the illusory bastion, an illusory moon was rising above an illusory castle. Once it rose high enough, a doorway between reality and the mirage would open in the heart of the ruins. Effie forced herself to smile. Gods, what a mess. The black dragon tore the vast expanse of the dark sky, the pale light of the shattered moon reflecting from his midnight scales. He flew with incredible speed, devouring distance with insatiable hunger. Perched on his back, Jet and Morgan were assaulted by powerful winds. Morgan was still paralyzed, but she could see where they were headed. Nightingale was flying south, leaving the lands surrounding the ruined castle far behind. He was flying toward the Stormzea. Soon enough, they left the broken lands behind. The crossing was sudden. One moment, they were surrounded by moonlit darkness, and the next, a pale light of dawn was bathing them in lilac splendor. The eerie visage of the shattered moon was gone, replaced by an empty and seemingly mundane sky. The world below was covered by the canopy of an ancient forest, and a river cut across it like a twisting ribbon. Why are they heading to the sea? Before too long, Nightingale folded his mighty wings and plummeted toward the ground. Landing in a forest clearing, he remained motionless for a moment. Morgan was surprised to see Soul Reaper stand and jump from the back of the dragon, landing softly on the grass. Straightening, she turned and looked up at the great beast. The dragon opened his maw, and an otherworldly voice escaped from it, speaking strangely human words. Good luck. Soul Reaper grinned darkly. Don't worry. I have 2 attempts, remember. Nightingale remained silent for a few moments. Then, his mesmerizing voice resounded above the clearing once again. Return alive. She laughed and turned away, waving a hand at him. That might be problematic. Morgan was feeling more and more bewildered, failing to understand why the 3 government saints were splitting up, and what exactly was their goal. Before she could really scrutinize all the available information, though, the dragon spoke directly to her. Hold tight, Lady Morgan. She could finally move again. Frustratingly, it was only to fulfill his second command. As Morgan grasped the midnight scales, Nightingale soared into the sky once more. He flew south, flying faster and faster. Then, she felt it. The unmistakable sensation of traveling between worlds. Suddenly, the landscape below changed. The ancient forest was gone, replaced by the endless expanse of concrete, glass, and alloy, by the vast labyrinth of NQSC. He returned to the waking world. Just as Morgan thought that, though, she felt the fabric of reality ripple around her once again, and NQSC disappeared like a mirage. An alien sky surrounded her from all sides now, full of frigid winds and dancing snow. He used his tether. Wait. Her eyes widened. Nightingale had come with her to Bastion. But before that, he had been anchored in the Song domain. And he had never replaced his tether. Looking down, she saw a stone city clinging to the slope of a towering volcano. A great bridge connected the volcano to a snowy mountain, and at its end, a magnificent palace of black obsidian stood, surrounded by a raging blizzard. It was Ravenheart. What? Morgan's chest swelled with wariness and fury. There was even a sense of betrayal. Was Nightingale going to bring her as a gift to Song? Was their mysterious scheme nothing more than a ploy to switch sides and ingratiate themselves to the Queen of Worms? The dragon flew above the city, then fell through the blizzard, landing heavily on the great bridge. His terrifying talons scraped against the ancient stone, and a moment later, Morgan suddenly found herself suspended in the air. The dragon had disappeared. As she fell down, Nightingale, now in his human form, caught her, held her in his arms for a second, then helped her stand. He was wearing his armor of ivory scales, already summoning his weapons. The Black Palace, and its guardians, were just ahead of them, obscured by the raging snowstorm. Morgan was suddenly able to move again. What the hell is going on? I don't even know anymore. It definitely did not seem like Nightingale was preparing to surrender. Instead, he looked at her, hesitated for a few moments, and said, Lady Morgan, I know that it will sound presumptuous, after what we've just done to you. But I would really appreciate your help. She looked at him darkly, considering cutting his head off right then and there. It would be a bit sad, to rob the world of that face, but also quite satisfying. Of course, she did not forget to activate all her defensive charms, determined to not fall into the trap of his voice so thoroughly once again. Help with what? What exactly are you three planning? Nightingale remained silent for a bit, then looked in the direction of the dark palace tensely. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "Well, I intend to conquer Ravenheart." Morgan blinked, struggling to maintain her composure. Nightingale, meanwhile, continued. "Most of Song forces are far away in Godgrave, but I have no doubt that the Queen left a few of her most powerful puppets behind. There are the human defenders to consider, as well. It will be a dire battle, no doubt. I am determined to win it even if I have to fight alone, but I would feel much better if you were fighting by my side." He turned to her, hesitated for a moment, and added awkwardly, "I am sorry for taking the chance to face Mordred away from you. But, Lady Morgan, there can still be a silver lining. After all, he has not won yet. And even if you failed to stop him from taking Bastion, wouldn't helping conquer Ravenheart instead be a kind of victory, as well?" Morgan stared at him silently. The Queen of Worms had sent her brother, Mordred, to conquer Bastion, the great citadel of Clan Valor. Morgan herself had been sent back to stop him, but Nightingale was offering her to help him conquer Ravenheart, the great citadel of Clan Song, instead. That was deeply ironic and completely insane, but also made a strange kind of sense. It would not be an easy thing to accomplish, though, with or without her. Morgan raised an eyebrow. "What about the other two, then? What are they doing?" Nightingale looked at her with surprise. He lingered for a few moments, then said neutrally, "Why, what else? Effie is in Bastion, while Jet is approaching Night Garden. They are going to conquer the other two great citadels, of course." Chapter 2229. Ravenheart was not undefended, of course. However, every saint of the Song domain was out there, on the battlefield, and even if some of them could return to the seat of the Queen's power in mere minutes by traversing the waking world, they had not done so yet. Perhaps something that prevented them from returning was happening in Godgrave at the moment. The news Morgan received from the battlefront was usually a few days old, and if Cassia was involved, Nightingale could very well be better informed about the current situation now than she was. The moment of attack would not have been chosen randomly. In any case, what met them at the gates of the magnificent Black Palace was a force consisting of mere awakened warriors led by ascended commanders, much like the rear garrisons that had protected Rivergate and Bastion before Morgan and her 6 saints, formerly her saints, rather, showed up. And the Queen's puppets, of course. Nightingale was well known in Ravenheart, so while the human defenders of the Black Palace were surprised by his impactful arrival, they were not immediately hostile. Until they noticed Morgan, that was. The puppets, on the other hand, were hostile from the very first moment. Strangely enough, the gates of the Black Palace were open, and the Dream Gate that was supposed to be standing on the slope of the volcano was now towering above the stone bridge itself, behind Morgan and Nightingale, its immense silhouette obscured by the snowstorm. The two of them had nowhere to retreat. As the puppets rushed onto the great bridge and the human defenders readied their weapons, Nightingale's voice drowned out the howling of the wind, full of irresistible authority. He only said one word. "Stop." The humans froze, turning into motionless sculptures. Morgan felt a faint pang of compassion for their humiliating plight, but she did not have time to dwell on that unexpected emotion. Because the puppets ignored the Dragonslayer's command, continuing to rush at them like a tide of murderous corpses. Well, it made sense. After all, the pilgrims were merely extensions of the Queen's power. Nightingale's aspect might have paralyzed Morgan in a moment of weakness, but she doubted that Ki Song would succumb to its insidious compulsion. He looked at Morgan earnestly. "Lady Morgan, if you will." She stared at him for a moment, still unsure what to do. Was she supposed to kill him? Or help him? Morgan felt a little exasperated. Finally, she turned toward the rushing puppets and muttered a curse. As she dashed forward, scarlet sparks swirled around her hand, forming a vague silhouette of a sword. Curses. Her sword was still manifesting itself when the first of the pilgrims reached her. So, Morgan cut the corpse apart with her bare hand. It fell easily, hinting that the Queen was not paying close attention to these particular puppets. For now, looking up through the snow, she regarded the motionless figures of the garrison soldiers for a split second. They were not going to offer any resistance. He's not planning to conquer Ravenheart without spilling a single drop of human blood, is he? Perhaps he was. A moment later, the tide of puppets was upon them, and Morgan had no time to think anymore. Far away, near the misty shore of the Stormzea, Jet came into view of the night garden. The colossal ship was still beached, laying tilted on the shattered ground where Mordred had left it. Of course, he had not left it unguarded. Somewhere out there, on one of the countless decks of the city-sized vessel, a reflection was laying in wait, ready to slay those who would dare to covet the great citadel. And a powerful one at that, a being equal in strength to a supreme titan. Jet had to defeat it and conquer the night garden. Exhaling slowly, she headed toward the gargantuan ship with a dark smile blooming on her lips. As she walked, a cold mist surrounded her figure, turning into a sinister war scythe. Can I defeat a supreme titan? Probably not. However, there was a reason why she was here, and not in Ravenheart or Bastion. It was because Jet had a unique advantage in the battle against this particular supreme titan. It was a reflection, after all. And a reflection could only reflect what was in front of it. Once the two of them clashed, the creature would most likely mirror Jet, which meant that it would suffer the curse of her flaw, as well. Its soul would shatter and start leaking essence, and eventually, it would die on its own. All she had to do was force the reflection to waste its essence while rationing her own, something Jet was a great master of, by now. She also had her aspect legacy and the souls contained within it, which she could consume if needed. And the hourglass memory, as well. Even if Jet lost once, she would get a second chance to destroy the reflection. That time, she would already be familiar with the flow and pattern of the battle. Ah, I really hate ships. Reaching the hull of the night garden, which seemed to extend into the distance like an endless plain, she turned into a stream of icy mist and rushed up its towering slope. Effie was still leaning on her spear when Mordred arrived. She knew he was coming because of how the ground trembled under the heavy footsteps of his vessels, Typhaon, Gnosis, and all the rest. She had battled them all at some point or another during the siege of Bastion. Apparently, she even destroyed most of them at least once inside the loop. That time was gone now, of course, erased forever, and she retained no memories of these legendary battles. Which was a bit of a shame, since Effie would have really loved to remember striking down that ugly behemoth, Typhaon. Or rather, striking down Mordred while the bastard was wearing Typhaon's corpse. Soon enough, gargantuan silhouettes rose above the ruins, and the Prince of Nothing jumped down into the desolate courtyard from the rubble of the castle's wall. He walked toward Effie with an amused smile on his lips. Saint Athena. Mordred looked behind her, lingered for a moment, and raised an eyebrow. Would you be so kind as to point me to where my sister is? We have some unfinished business, she and I. Effie studied him for a bit, then shrugged. Please accept my sincerest apologies, Your Highness, but I regrettably cannot. She is indisposed. Oh, but you can talk to me instead. Mordred laughed. Don't tell me that she ran away. Gods, must I chase her like one would a frightened rabbit? Well, honestly, that can be quite entertaining as well. Nevertheless, I can't help but feel a bit disappointed. He looked at Effie with a pleasant, chilling smile. I must admit that I am curious, though, if Morgan is gone, then why do you remain? Chapter 2230. Lord's Gift. Effie moved slightly, shifting her weight away from the spear to be able to raise it quickly, if need be. Looking at Mordred calmly, she said, Actually, I'm also curious. Why are you still wasting your time here? Don't you know that your father is currently fighting Ki Song? If you don't hurry up and make yourself scarce, she'll kill him all on her own. That'd be pretty sad, right? I mean, since you're obsessed with revenge to a demented degree. Mordred's smile widened a little. Oh, thank you for your concern. To be honest, I'll be pretty inconsolable if someone kills him before me. Incensed, even, and very, very cross with the person who robbed me of the pleasure of killing him myself. No need to worry, though, I'll depart for Godgrave as soon as I'm finished here. He looked at Effie with an openly disdainful expression. Shouldn't take me long to sort things out, anyway. She grinned. You say that, but in all these years, you've never once dared to try crawling into my soul. Everyone goes around being all scared of your Royal Highness, Prince Mordred of Nowhere, but I always suspected that you're all talk and no bite, well, figuratively speaking. You know, some of us were actually hunting nightmare creatures and fighting for survival each and every goddamn day while you sat around in a perfectly safe prison cell, doing nothing. Effie chuckled. Even Morgan is better than you, and she literally carries her silver spoon wherever she goes, mind you. She was brave enough to leave her soul wide open, at least, and yet, what have you done despite receiving such a brazen invitation? Nothing at all. In all these months, you had not challenged her to a soul duel. Why? Because doing so would have actually put your life at risk. The rest of us have to take that risk all the time, you know. Aren't you nothing but a coward? Mordred continued to look at her with a pleasant smile. His strange mirror-like eyes seemed to shine in the darkness with the pale radiance of the reflected moonlight, making him look quite eerie. How unexpectedly eloquent. Are you perchance stalling for time, Saint Athena? Effie smiled darkly. Oops, you caught me. He shook his head. Quite a clumsy attempt. What is your plan, anyway? Surely, you are not planning to fight me and my distinguished collection of transcendent attires alone. That'd be a bit too much, even for someone as unwise as you. There it was, the moment of truth. The moon must have already climbed quite high above the illusory bastion. Effie took a deep breath. It sounded like you called me a fool. If a madman calls someone a fool, though, that ought to be a compliment, right? Oh, by the way, Your Highness, I wanted to ask. Do you remember the Lord of Shadows? Mordred's smile grew a little forced. The Lord of Shadows. Ah, I do, he gave me quite a fright, the last time we met. An unusual man, to say the least. What about him? Effie shook her head slowly. Well, it seems that you left an impression, as well. Enough so that he wanted to send you a little gift. Surrounded by the towering figures of his transcendent vessels, Mordred allowed himself to frown slightly. A gift, you say? He shouldn't have. As his vessels moved, Mordred asked pleasantly. What is the present? Effie took a step back as she activated the Black Beast locket and summoned what was hidden inside it into the world. I can't believe I let that creepy bastard talk me into this. Her locket contained the beast farm, and it sometimes served as a mobile base for the wolf army, as well. At the moment, however, there was something else taking residence there. Something that made her skin crawl, and cold sweat run down her spine. As if she was sitting on a bomb. Effie flashed Mordred a wide smile. Oh, nothing much, well, see for yourself. In the next moment, something massive appeared on the rubble between her and Mordred, obscuring him from view. It was a towering mountain of gray flesh overgrown with scarlet moss, 100 revolting limbs extending from it like a dreadful forest. The moment it escaped the locket, Effie suddenly found herself unable to breathe. A terrifying presence crashed into her, pressing her into the ground. Her eyes widened, and an involuntary groan escaped from her lips. She couldn't even look directly at the creature, afraid that her mind would be harmed by what she saw, not that she would, determined to avoid looking at it at all costs. Well, it wasn't every day that one found themselves mere steps away from a cursed demon. A cursed demon who was already awakening from unnatural slumber, having been somehow lulled to it by the Lord of Shadows. The forest of revolting limbs stirred, and countless monstrous eyes suddenly opened all across the gray expanse of the harrowing being's formless body. Effie was already running away by then, headed for the point in the ruins where True Bastion and its illusory copy were connected. Mordred, however, was a few moments too late to react. It took him that long to realize what he was looking at, to begin with. But it was already too late by the time he did, precisely because he had looked. Because there were creatures in the dream realm that could sense someone's gaze, and gaze back. The cursed demon became aware of Mordred at the same time as Mordred became aware of it. Effie sensed the ruins shudder and felt a deafening noise wash over her as she ran. Don't look back. Either the cursed demon would kill Mordred, or it would not. Either way, the Prince of Nothing would be preoccupied for a while, hopefully, until the battle in Godgrave ended. Unleashing a cursed one in the heart of the sword domain was a suboptimal choice, to say the least, but Effie would be able to switch True Bastion and its illusory version back after conquering the Citadel, thus making the former a prison for the terrifying creature and containing it within the Great Mirror. They were desperate enough to take the risk, and Mordred was dangerous enough to take no chances. Using all her incredible physical prowess, Effie ran across the ruins like a bolt of lightning. The end. Your feedback is appreciated.